Ollie, it is an honor to have you on the show. I've been meaning to organize this for a long time, and I appreciate you carving out the time in your schedule.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. Very nice to be with you. The king of seaweed, Mr. Dagobi.
Nice one. So, for a bit of context, you're known as an ocean explorer, three times world record holder. You have spent something like 2.5% of your life alone on the ocean, and you still remain the only person to have rowed solo from America to England. What would your, say, 12, 14 years old self, so what would a 12, 14 years old Ollie think if he knew what you have achieved?
Yeah, very, really interesting question, Ved. Well, maybe my thinking hasn't evolved that much since I was 12 or 14, because when I was 12 or 14, all I was dreaming about was rowing across the Atlantic, inspired by a man called Peter Bird, who was sadly lost at sea trying to row across the Pacific Ocean I think, in 1996. And yes. So since I was 12, I was fascinated by the idea of ocean rowing. I found out more and more about it, and I set my sights on trying to cross from west to east, from New York back to the UK, and that was my obsession for 10 years until I did it. And then I did do it. What was that? About 10 years ago now? No, sorry, 15 years ago. And so I suppose I have yeah, followed my dreams and sought to achieve them, selfishly or otherwise. But yeah, I think I would be happy, I suppose, as a 12-year-old, because I achieved what I set out or what I was dreaming about then. I have now done some of those things, and certainly there's more to do, but yeah, I'll be pleased probably.
And I heard about a yellow kayak. What's the story around that?
Yeah, I was given a yellow kayak for my 7th birthday.
Yeah, yeah,
Is
yeah.
that the story?
That's the story
Yeah.
I heard, yeah.
Yeah, well, when I was 7, I grew up on the Suffolk coast, between Suffolk and London, in fact, and was given a kayak when I was age 7. And my parents should be careful what they wish for, because if you give a child a
Yeah.
kayak, what's he going to do? And yeah, obviously it went from paddling in ponds and lakes, and then ultimately to trying to cross large oceans by kayak. And so it was the planting of a seed, which took a unusual unusual sort of a growth trajectory, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. Do you think, was there any other specific moment, story, or person, or experience even that defined your path toward an expedition career?
I think so many of those circumstances or occasions when your life takes a sort of certain pivot or glances off into a certain direction, unconscious. But one of the reflections that I often think about is that Ranulph Fiennes came to talk to us as when we were children at school. I was probably aged 11, sitting cross-legged on the floor, and this man was there, giving a lecture about a recent expedition he'd run to circumnavigate the globe by the polar axis. And I just remember being captivated by this guy and his daring do. And he'd been in the military, he'd been fighting in the desert, he'd had hovercrafts and ships and Land Rovers and skidoos on this expedition. And it sort of dawned on me, perhaps, that you could make a living running these expeditions. And he was certainly, is and was, one of my heroes and inspirations.
And that's what you set out to do basically for the following 10 years. You kept going with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. He was certainly one of many inspirations. Probably there'd be others more sort of marine based, maybe people like Pete Goss or Ellen MacArthur, perhaps. But yeah, I did exactly from well, pretty much since I left university. I was running marine expeditions of one sort or another for about 15 years, sometimes full time, sometimes with other other jobs or other businesses going on in the background. But my main focus was trying to row around the world for a long chunk of that time. And I made one attempt in about 12 years ago, unsuccessfully. I was trying to row around Antarctica, and I got from Tasmania to New Zealand, and we had to just stop the project or suspend the project in New Zealand due to problems with the boat. but I've tried 3 more times to raise the funds for that campaign, getting very close, but sort of always falling at the 11th hour. So there's certainly unfinished business on that expedition. Actually, a very cool explorer called Fyodor Konyakov, a Russian guy. He's a priest. He's about 74 years old, I think. He recently almost completed that journey. He was about a third of the way across he was almost two-thirds of the way round. So huge feat, and his boat was effectively falling to bits. Everything was failing, all the systems were failing, and so he abandoned the voyage. But yeah, I think he's really broken the mold and proving that it's achievable.
But nobody has actually done it yet.
Not yet, Fed, not yet. Keep it quiet.
All right, I think we'll come back to that. Is there one of the ones that you completed? You know, you've done solo rowing, ocean kayaking. Is there one that was particularly significant for you that you want to maybe walk me through?
I think probably in a way, the most satisfactory expedition probably I ever did was rowing across the Atlantic, because that was my, childhood dream from the age of 12. It took 10 years to come to fruition. And from a sort of purist standpoint, I set off on the dock in New York, standing on the dock, and I finished on the beach in the Scilly Isles. And it was just land to land. It wasn't unsupported, but it was just a really pure project, and it went. If I'd sort of had a idea in my mind how it was going to play out, it played out really perfectly. It was a really beautiful expedition, and so that was probably the my favorite trip, and it was my longest time at sea, 124 days, and my first major expedition, and I was only 23. It was quite pretty formative in many respects.
And what sort of, you mentioned it took basically 10 years to get to that point, and what sort of preparation goes into an expedition like that? How important is preparation, and how long does that phase take?
I think it's the preparation is 90%. You need the money. The money is always the hardest part of all these trips, because essentially once you start, then it's just rowing, eating, sleeping until you get to the other side.
Easy.
Okay, a little bit of yeah. Well, in many respects, certainly easier than the jeopardy of fundraising. So on the fitness and the training side, my view is as long as you have a good level of base fitness, then you're going to be fine, because really the only way to get fit for those sorts of trips when you're rowing all day, every day, is to do it. And after 1 or 2 weeks, then you're going to be pretty fit. But as long as you're in good condition and injury free going into it, then you have a very good chance on the fitness and physical side. On the mental side, I think the inclination is very important, and why do you want to do it? Is it, for me, it was a lifelong dream, and so it wasn't for me it wasn't to be endured. It was really, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed almost the entire trip. I loved it. I didn't actually want to land. I didn't want to come back.
Really?
Yeah, and I didn't find it lonely. Yeah, it's a bit uncomfortable, but of course you expect that. You
Yeah.
um
How did you find your mental state changing? I guess from the beginning, from the initial stages of the trip, and I can't imagine how one would feel, and where you'd be mentally after 2 months on your own in the ocean. Did you see that, like, a sort of progression?
I think you slow down mentally. Probably, sorry, I'm being probably a bit slow today because I was up very early this morning. But it feels the same in terms of when you've been at sea for 4 months and you haven't seen anybody and you haven't really spoken to anybody. Your social faculties slow down for sure. You don't have that quick wit or repartee. There's been no interaction with someone else. You certainly, that becomes rusty or dull. And I remember late on, and it might have been fatigue because it was a period of very bad weather. But I remember one morning trying to put my boots on, and it took me ages to put my boots on. And ultimately, I realized I was never going to get them on because they were back to front, and I was trying to put the toe into the heel. So you become a bit dull, mentally dull. But then you adapt very quickly. And when I got back, you do adjust to being back in society, back in the mix. So things become, I think you adjust to the extremes of that environment and the violent motion of the boat and the very basic diet. And indeed you adapt to being alone quite quickly, you know. And I enjoyed the solitude, but in a similar sense, you readjust, I'd say, to being back on land quite quickly. And as I said, because I was only 23, maybe you're more adaptable at a younger age, more sort of malleable. I don't know.
Yeah. Speaking of, at 23, because you talked about the money. At 23, presumably with very little track record, how did you get Virgin to take a punt on you and your project?
Well, it probably wasn't pre-internet, but it was, it was the early days of the internet, and I remember just writing. First of all, I knew I had to get some credibility because I tried to raise the money when I was 16. There was an organization called still is, the Ocean Rowing Society, which was run by a lovely man called Kenneth Crutchlow. And they ran out of a very small office in Camden Town, and I used to go and see them from time to time and get advice. How do you do it? How do you raise the money? And they thought it was a complete pain, and they're like, go away, grow up. You need to be at least 18. You have to raise £70,000, and which it's a lot of money now, but it was a huge amount of money then. Um, and so they said you got to write letters. So I was writing letters, and you need an angle. What's your angle? So I said, oh, I'm going to be the youngest and fastest to row the Atlantic. I'm going to go on this route that no one else wants to go on. And I remember at least 1,000 of those letters printed out.
1,000.
Yeah, 1,000. And I don't know how strategic, I forget, it probably wasn't very strategic. It was probably any big company that you would recognize. And you forget even how you found the address of who to send it. Obviously, that's now easy. You just look up the address online, but maybe it's the yellow pages. But ultimately, I remember exhibiting the boat at a school. It was a school open day, and we're exhibiting the boat. It was like a charities open day, and a guy came up to me, and he worked for Norwich Union, which is now Aviva, the insurance company, and he then took the project, or had some blurb about the project. He took it to his marketing department, and they gave me £3,000, and it wasn't a lot of money, but it was like a blue chip seal of approval. And then um, I'd written to Virgin and used the sort of story saying, your planes are going back and forth across the Atlantic all the time, Virgin Atlantic. Why don't we have, you can follow the dot on your aeroplane, on the maps they put on the back on the
Oh, nice. I like that.
in-flight maps. And I say you could have the rowing boat going across and the airplane going across. And anyway, they responded to that. And ultimately, yeah, Richard Branson phoned up. He'd phoned me up one day. I was
He phoned you up.
walking down the street in London, and he said, I will fund I will put £24,000 into the project. And that was, we were trying to raise more money, but that was enough to buy the boat. Then we had a bit of money from Norwich Union, had a bit of money from them. And I borrowed some money from my dad, and we got it off the ground. And then we ran out of money. I remember, I can't remember why. We needed some money for something to do with the project, and we asked Virgin again, and we had to go to New York and collect this envelope of money from the airport, from the Virgin Atlantic. Yeah, and so that's how it was. And then at the end, I had to pay back the money to my dad, and so we made a little documentary about it. Yeah, it was all a bit different then. You didn't do it on your phone. We had to have cameras. It was all on tapes. And then a friend of mine made it into a documentary for his university, final piece of work for his university course. And we screened that and sold some tickets. And so that paid off the debt from the project. And it was really a, organic sort of homemade project. It wasn't very corporate or.
Yeah. Do you reckon, I was listening to you now and talking about how obviously technology had put you in a situation that was very different from how you would probably do it now. And I was wondering whether the bar was higher in a way, and that gave you a competitive advantage in the sense that now Virgin probably gets 1,000 a day, 1,000 people reaching out in various through various channels. Whereas maybe back then, because it was a bit more analog and a bit more difficult to even just get the address, maybe that filtered out some of the competition.
I mean, I think even then. I think it's always been very challenging to get sponsorship because who do you think of when you think of, polar expeditions or ocean expeditions? Straight away, you think of probably Virgin because Richard was an explorer, or you think of Rolex because, that's their endless.
Red Bull.
Red Bull, yeah, yeah, Red Bull. It used to be a champagne brand, Mum Champagne sponsored a lot of expeditions. Anyway, there was all the same sort of businesses would sponsor it. And a lot of the watch companies obviously align with expedition stuff. So, and Land Rover, sorry, was the one I was trying to think about. But we had a meeting with Land Rover, and I remember him telling us, the head of sponsorship, saying that he had 400 pictures a day landing on his
Wow.
desk.
Okay. So even then,
I mean, that was more recent than that trip, but I think it's always been competitive, and probably, yeah, you're right. It's certainly the landscape for sponsorship has changed enormously, and the metrics, when we were doing it, I think one thing that hasn't changed is the driver. And if the person signing it off or the person with the purse strings likes what you're doing and they like you, then that is kind of the bottom line. If it then aligns with whatever corporate or marketing strategy that happens to fit at the time, then that's a sort of double tick in the box. But I remember talking to a CEO of a big asset management company, and the guy liked golf, so he only sponsored golf.
okay.
So there was no point talking to him about, do you want to sponsor a sailing boat or something? Because he just sponsored golf,
Yeah,
and
and that was it.
sometimes it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you if the end goal and story is what matters the most, but maybe even like you say, appealing to a particular something that the person handing on over the money can relate to or is passionate about. Maybe that's and sometimes it's just being in the right place and the right time, I suppose.
Definitely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it works in many and mysterious ways, but and look at people like Ranulph Fiennes, where they've had sponsors who have stuck with them time and again. Or I had Virgin, who supported me on multiple projects. So when you build that rapport and you are generating, I guess the return from the projects used to be, and still to some extent is publicity, it's exposure, and used to be measured in column inches and airtime. And they used to have clippings agencies, so they would literally count how many clippings you got. And now it's obviously the metrics are rather different, as you say, in the digital world, and obviously social media is much more of a driver. So I think it's changed. I don't know. Yes, yeah, I think you're right. It really is more competitive, but I think it's made it more accessible in some respects. That you do feel now you can contact pretty well anyone.
It's just it's maybe more down to the person, and as in allowing yourself to try, I suppose. I feel like a lot of people almost rule themselves out before they start.
In what respects do you
Well,
mean?
I completely agree with what you say that you could potentially contact anybody, but there's still a lot of self-talk that can go inside your head, thinking, "Oh no, you can't. You can't possibly talk to that person. They're never gonna care about you. They're never gonna listen to what you have to say," and so you end up. And I see this in so many respects, not necessarily just trying to contact some big famous person, but in many projects and respects, that sometimes you're your worst enemy in the sense that without maybe even realizing you rule yourself out for an opportunity before you even have the chance to fail, to try and fail.
Yeah, no, I totally see what you mean. Yeah, you're afraid to ask the question. You're afraid to make the approach. You don't have the confidence in your project or what you're doing, and yeah, I think you need for all these projects and for Seaweed as well, you need that sort of blind optimism and faith and a level of bloody mindedness where you're gonna carry on regardless. And I think having that from a young age is, when you're 12, if that's your dream, and you're gonna achieve it come hell or high water. And I mean, I think probably for anyone who had to talk to me for 10 years from 12 to 22, that was all I was broadcasting, what I was gonna do. I was very obsessed.
That says a lot about focus, though, because I think I was maybe the opposite. There was a million things that I was interested in, and it would change every month. And there's something to say about being so focused that gives you almost, you
But
know,
I failed a lot as well, Fed. I had, well, my main failure was this attempt to row around the world. but at least I made one attempt already, and then I failed to make a second attempt, but I did try, and we got turned down. Yeah, 3 times I think we failed, got close and failed on the funding the campaign. So yeah, I know what that failure tastes like. What 18 months to get to a sponsorship agreement, and then it falls down at the last minute. But I think you learn from those failures, and there's some confidence in that. You got to the end of it, and okay, you didn't get over the line, but even to get that far, it's what can you take from the ashes of failure. I think it's quite a important lesson, because we're all going to have failures, whatever we do, unless you're some superhumans.
So it's all about what you take out of that experience, I suppose.
But I was talking to someone about it in the car this morning. We were saying how gloomy, really, we think the UK is quite a gloomy country in its outlook. And we're contrasting the American outlook and the UK outlook, and how the US approach to other people's successes, whether that's, sporting, socially, they really celebrate success, and they wish success on others. And I think that's very much the opposite in the UK. And especially in the UK, we denigrate failure, whereas in America, they almost celebrate failure. It's like, oh well, fed well, your venture failed, but good on you for trying. You're gonna take another spin at it, or do something else. Whereas here, I think it's the opposite.
How much and in what way do you think that reflects on the startup and business sort of sphere?
I think it's hard for me to see, because we're in the startup space, and we're surrounded by a lot of other startups. Yeah, I think we're in a bubble of, you sort of feel there's endless startups, and there's nothing stopping people from it. It feels a very popular space to be in. It's a really hard place to raise money, I think, here. And if that's the starting point for any startup, I can think of two related anecdotes. We had quite an extensive discussion with early investors, and we couldn't agree terms, and they wanted a lot of the company for not a lot of money. And they would say the opposite. And they were back and forth. And I remember them just saying, well, 90% of startups fail. So, I was like, and I've heard that, time and again. And I think that's a really interesting mindset to say, well, if an investor looks at 90% of startups fail, but they're still going to do it, it's the sort of, you need completely the opposite mindset. If you're the founder of the company, you need to think like, well, 10% of them are successful. It's it's a really funny view of how things work. And then we had an American investor. He was a Scottish guy, and he was very senior oil executive, and he'd left oil industry to set up his own business in the wind sector. And he was just advising us a bit, and he said, the trouble is you're not raising enough money, and this is the worst country to raise money in. And he'd gone to the States to raise money for his new venture. He had 3 contacts. He went to New York, and by the time he came back 6 months later, from his 3 contacts, obviously had proliferated a network and whatever, but he'd raised $500 million, and he had the funding for his business. Imagine trying to do the same thing in the UK, maybe, but feels a lot less likely. So yeah, I think that cultural appetite for risk and backing, backing long shots is much less. We're a conservative nation, aren't we? I don't think we're sort of, yeah, we're not those sort of, America was the land of pioneers, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think you can feel that all the way across the spectrum, from chatting with your mates at the pub all the way to talking to investors. You can feel that different outlook toward risk and celebrating failure and approaching unlikely and strange ventures. We talked about preparation. Outside of preparation and actually getting to the start line, what were the absolute toughest moments for you? Could you describe them for someone that has absolutely no idea what it might feel like?
Yeah, the toughest elements. I mean, I think inevitably, however well organized you are, these things tend to be quite hectic in their organizations. I remember both before trying to row around the Southern Ocean and before trying to cross the Atlantic, it's just that for those weeks before, or sometimes only days before, frantic packing. And you think these things are going to be, it ain't like NASA. It's not a space mission where there's vast teams of people packing the food, counting the calories. It's often, it's a sort of a home team or a family effort to get everything ready and packed. And so that's always quite stressful because you'd think you'd like to have the boat just packed away and then you could have a few days to chill out and relax before you set off into the wild blue yonder. But that's never, in my experience, been the reality. So yeah, those last minutes of kit prep and getting packed up, ready to go, um, because you don't want to forget the tin opener. Always quite fraught and not that enjoyable. And I think the jumping off moment is always quite not very enjoyable. It's the yeah, I would call it the green light moment, like stepping out of an aeroplane. You're sort of in a queue of parachutists shuffling to the back of the aircraft, and then you know that when the light goes, you got to step out and off a perfectly serviceable aeroplane into the sky. And I think that is a horrible moment. It's like so many things figuratively, the anticipation of things is always much worse than the reality, but it's that transition. Sort of once you get out of sight of land and you're just away and you're on your own and you've got to just crack on with it. But it's that sort of transition phase from being on shore with the security of land and creature comforts and all that good stuff, and then the harsh realities of the discomforts of being on expedition settle in, but you're not really hardened or conditioned to them at that point. And getting used to that new violent environment, yeah, it's a rude awakening. But then that wears off, and then it becomes very normal. It becomes normal to then do your 12 hours rowing shifts every day, eating. I really enjoyed the food. The wildlife's incredible, the seascapes, the skyscapes, so that makes up for all of the sort of privations.
From your description, it almost sounds like it's much more of a mental game than it is a physical challenge.
Yeah, I think 99% mental game. Yeah, provided you're fit and able, then you can row, and then it's what's the difference if you row, 10 minutes or 12 hours? Well, that's in your head, right? It's only your head. It's only your mind that keeps you rowing, you know, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. And sort of, back to that point of do you enjoy it or do you endure it? And okay, there's a bit of both, but it seems rather a shame to put all that effort into a project like that to just endure the whole thing. If you endure and hate the whole thing, then why? It is a voluntary thing at the end of the day. Why bother? It's an interesting point, I think, on inclination. You know, what motivates people to do certain things? Why do you do that? Is it to tick a box? Is it so you can tell your friends, or you can put it on your social media, or
I'm sort of scribbling away because I think that some of these things will revisit very soon when we talk about the similarity between what you've done and entrepreneurship. Yeah, before we move on, I wanted to ask you a couple of quick ones. What are the moments that you think you'll cherish the most in your memory?
well, my memory is getting pretty bad already. But there are certainly individual moments, but it's probably the sense of awe about being in that incredible wilderness environment, in the middle of nowhere, far out to sea, surrounded by hundreds of dolphins, or you know several whales bigger than the boat, or at night the plankton, the bioluminescent plankton, sort of pulsating underneath the boat. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. You can't really imagine it. It's hard to explain those sorts of wildlife encounters, I guess. But in the setting, completely solitary, it's yeah, it's hard to translate that. But you just feel very small and sort of insignificant, and you realize how insignificant we all are in the grand scheme of the wider universe. So I enjoyed sort of that realization, and
Why do you think that is important and enjoyable?
because I think it's well, relating it to sort of what I'm doing at the moment, and when you sort of meet people who consider themselves important, and you realize how really no one is actually very important in 100 years. No one will remember anything about any of us, and so really you need to, it is that call to arms, that to seize the day, to do what you want to do. You're here for a very short amount of time, and how do you want to spend it? How do you want to spend those precious hours and minutes? So having an appreciation for time and space, I think, is really important or really useful. Having a sense of perspective of where we fit in the universe and really how insignificant we all are.
Does that come back in your day to day? Like when, say, you're in a meeting, or you're thinking about the vision for your company, or you're thinking about you're just about to go on stage for to give a speech.
I think it does in my approach to life. I'm pretty light-hearted, pretty irreverent, probably quite silly. I've never particularly enjoyed institutional life or corporate life where we have to be very straight-laced and we have to be very careful what we say in case someone takes offense. But you could be in a board meeting and someone said something nobody's understood, but everyone's afraid to put up their hand and ask that person. Sort of, ask the stupid question because otherwise everyone's just sitting there in complete ignorance. But no one wants to look stupid. The pretenses are daft, right?
Hey, you gave a TEDx talk about the benefit of risk. How do you think about risk, and in particular, how do you balance the urge to go on an adventure with the genuine possibility of something going horribly wrong, from failing to getting seriously hurt? What's the balance?
I think the balance of risk changes, throughout your life, and I think it depends what is the if you play it through the lens of what's the worst case scenario. So if it goes wrong, what's going to happen? Well, if your boat catches fire in the middle of the Atlantic, then maybe you can get the life raft. If the life raft is burned, well, you're toast. Yeah, you've had it. And then when I was 23, well, I didn't have any children. Objectively, I wasn't leaving anyone behind. Okay, my parents, my siblings, but I didn't feel much sense of responsibility, you can say then. Then when I did an expedition in 2016. We made a kayak journey from Greenland back to Scotland. By then I was engaged to be married, so I had a little bit more responsibility. But it didn't weigh very heavily on me then. But now I have children, and so I would weigh risk really differently now, I think. But not that that would stop me necessarily taking risk, but I would measure the risk much more. I would mitigate the risk much more. And I think from starting expeditions in let's say 2000, my risk management, if you want to call it that, has probably got much better. And to the point of it becoming quite boring. So when we did the kayak from Greenland to Scotland, it was a really well planned, equipped, funded and executed project, and it was almost to the point it was a bit dull because not much went wrong. There was limited jeopardy, and that was, to a large extent down to sort of conservative management of the project. We were very careful with the weather. We really monitored the weather. We had equipped ourselves really well, but the margin for error on that trip was very, very narrow. So if something had gone wrong, it would have gone wrong very quickly and very hard to recover from. I wouldn't do that sort of trip now. The unacceptable level of risk. Whereas I would do a rowing expedition because the boats are much safer, much stronger, more seaworthy. Your margin for error is bigger, and so it's just how you manage the risk. I think I'm trying to do my motorbike license at the moment, and I think that's an interesting one of how you approach risk, right? Because it's an unnecessary risk to take, but to the extent that the risk is in your control, it's down to you how you ride that motorbike. You don't have to ride it super fast. You can ride it, conservatively. You can wear protective equipment and you can manage the risk. And yeah, you might get run over by a bin lorry, but you might get run over by a bin lorry anyway.
What's the thinking there? Is there some sort of maybe trips?
No, I just always wanted to ride a motorbike.
If a complete outsider, say a very rational alien, came to Earth and looked at us, they'll see that all the continents are mapped by satellites, all the knowledge in the world, all the knowledge of the world is in our pockets. We can connect with any other human being pretty much anywhere in the world without leaving the couch. What is the point of adventure? And is there a role for adventure, and how would you explain it to the alien?
Think there's an innate human need for adventure, and maybe for the alien, he can understand because he's bothered to venture or adventure all the way to planet Earth. Why did he bother? But maybe his adventure was in search of food. Maybe he's going to eat us, or maybe he wants to plunder our resources to fill up his rocket. So I think, I think it's the context of adventure, isn't it? Because I think in terms of geographical exploration, that is, there's no more North Poles or South Poles to find, but it's that I think the limits of physical exploration continue, right? But that people are going to continue to try and run 100 meters faster than someone else, or dive deeper, or jump higher. I do think I think some of the physical records get a bit sort of tortuous, don't they? It's the Everest was climbed in 1952, I think, and now it's still being climbed by the first, the first person from Cameroon, or the first person, and they become these sort of rather,
A bit forced, do you think?
yeah. I mean, it helps for people for raising a sponsorship, I think, to have a record or claim an original trip. But I think it comes back to the motivation of doing it. Are you doing the trip to have an interesting experience? And it will be interesting to travel down the Congo River, not because that's been a first, but there'd just be a fascinating thing to do. Quite dangerous at the moment, but so I think the opportunity for adventure is different from the golden age of exploration, say at the turn of the 20th century. But undoubtedly, there's still mountains that haven't been climbed, places that haven't been visited, in the deepest, darkest jungles, the bottom of the oceans. So there are those untouched places, and there are those limits of physical exploration of the limits of the sort of physical capabilities. I think will continue to be pushed, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering whether it even matters whether it's been done before or not. Whether it's just, like you say, a human need and it's just adventure for adventure's sake, and it doesn't matter if somebody else has done it already. This is my experience.
Yeah, I don't think it matters at all. I mean, you look at the queues of people going up Everest. Obviously, it doesn't worry them. For me personally, it does devalue it, or it takes away the. It's a bit like if you want to go to the beach on a bank holiday, you want to go and find your own beach. You don't want to go to Brighton Beach where there's a million other people. And in the expedition sense, it held limited appeal to me to go and do something that's already been done. Because if you're going to put in months, if not years, of effort in building a big expedition, raising the money, committing the time, or allocating a considerable percentage of your life to it, do you really want to do a challenge that's been done umpteen times, or do you want to tread new ground? And for me, the new ground, the sort of doing a novel project is what is really interesting, because you have that jeopardy. It's like, can you do it or not? And it's a good example, I think, is when I rode the Atlantic. It was my dream from when I was 12, and I knew exactly which way I wanted to go. I knew how I wanted to do it, and really I wanted to do it solo. But then a friend said to me, I was working with him at the time, and he said, "Oh, I'll come with you. Let's put we found someone who was selling a boat, and we said, oh, we could split the cost of the boat, and then we could afford it." But it then came up in conversation that he wanted to go the other way. He wanted to do the from the Canaries to the Caribbean. It's a very common route, and I just really didn't want to go that way because it's done every year. There's dozens of boats doing it. So for me, there's no novelty. There's no challenge in it. But it's not such an interesting proposition.
Is that why you picked the industry and the business that you picked? In 2021, you founded Archipelago, an offshore mariculture business. Is the search for something that is somewhat pioneering a big driver for you in that decision?
Yes, I think it is. I think being involved with something which is new, novel, not fully established, but you can see the potential, and you can see many ways in which it might unfold. And there's jeopardy, there's a lot of unknown, and there is risk. Will it unfold in a lucrative way, or will it not? So yeah, I think that is one of the drivers. I used to work in biomass, in renewable energy, and that was quite a novel system at the time. And that was fascinating. We were developing new supply chains. How do you secure the fuel to enable you to finance the power station? And so building those fuel supply chains was fascinating, all the way from forest through the logistics and into the factory. into the power station. And yeah, I loved that because we were developing something new, and we did it. That was, it was successful. So it was really interesting to be a part of a quite a new industry and go all the way through from development to completion. And I see it as a similar challenge in seaweed. I think the seaweed sector is more complex, and there are many ways at which you can go. I think it's frustrating because it's like many of the sort of sustainable industries, it's not really that competitive yet. It's expensive. It's not necessarily functionally as good as some of the conventional products. But the potential, if we can get it right as a both a product which has economic and environmental goods, is worth pursuing.
Before we dive deeper into Archipelago and what's your vision for the business going forward, I was going to ask you, what have you found to be the similarities between leading expeditions and now entrepreneurship?
I think I think they're very, very similar indeed. It's it's essentially it's just project development. So you have the project or the idea, and then you have to bring it to fruition. So it's putting together the plan or the business plan or the pitch, whatever you want to call it, and then finding someone to sell it to. Yeah, it's very similar. It's what we always did with expeditions. Is this is the project, this is what we're going to do, this is who's going to be interested in, and this is the exposure we're going to try and get you. And for the seaweed, it's this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to make money, and this is how you'll get your return. And here's all the risks along the way.
Yeah. So it's about convincing people still that you can pull it
Well,
off.
we don't try and convince people too much because we want them to make their own mind up, and we don't sugarcoat it. It's an early stage industry and it's very complex, and there is a incumbent industry in Asia. So I think it remains to be seen if we can unlock it. But it's exciting being in a cohort of, enthusiastic and intelligent and sort of driven young companies trying to make it work.
What do you recognize as the common building blocks between preparing an expedition and building a business? Funding being one, obviously, that you mentioned.
Yeah, funding for sure. Funding is the number one probably ingredient for the company and the team and the vision. What are you trying to ultimately, what are you trying to achieve in what time frame? Who do you need to help you do it? And then on the funding side, yes, you need the funding, but where do you want it to come from? Who do you want to be on your cap table? What investors do you want? And I think that's the same with expeditions. It's what sponsors do you want to align with? And by the end, but by the time we did the Greenland expedition, we had a fantastic roster of sponsors. We had Bremont Watches, we had Virgin, we had Land Rover, and so if you were choosing a dream team of sponsorship, that was sort of it. And I think we strive. We've on our investor. I'm really happy with our roster of investors. We have obviously different relationships with all of them, but a lot of them we're very close to. We talk to regularly. Some of them are more happy with just different updates, but it's an important relationship, I think. And yeah, so trying to have an investor roster where people bring different things to the party, not just finance necessarily. Different experiences, different advice.
And is there a parallel to be drawn also around enduring versus enjoying that you hinted at earlier?
Yeah, yeah, I think there certainly is. I think, you need to, I don't know what the ratio is, but you can only enjoy spreadsheets so much.
What's worse, is it the blisters on a kayak or a spreadsheet?
Spreadsheet. And I think that's the interesting thing with what we're doing at the moment. We very office based, but also quite operational. We're early stage, so everyone's doing a bit of everything. And that is often it's nice to have a bit of both, but it's also quite challenging to do both the physical and operational work and the more sort of business development, pitching and capital raising. There's not enough hours in the day to do it all, but they're all quite different skill sets. And if you think of it in athletic terms, it's good to be conditioned into your main sport. And so you kind of end up as a Corinthian, where you're not necessarily a really honed athlete at any of the one sports. You just a reasonable amateur, yeah, reasonable amateur or generalist at all of them.
And is there a solo aspect of being a business leader as well? Again, drawing a parallel with your solo expeditions.
I think it's quite solitary being in the startup world, and we're a small team at the moment, and therefore often we're working quite, quite individually, because everyone will be working on often on different things, or we're quite often working remotely. But I'm looking forward to, as the team grows, that we will have more sort of collegiate working and have more of a team dynamic. I think that's important, but certainly, and I think it can feel like you are an outlier, and can do you what? I think in the startup world, people I've spoken to quite a lot of people who say that they have a permanent knot in their stomach. They're permanently uncomfortable, basically. I was talking to someone who'd set up a security business, and he said that was, his permanent state now was that he had a knot in his stomach. Were they going to win new business? Were they going to get new contracts, new clients? And I think that's the same for us. It's, are we going to bring in new investment? Are our crops going to work? Are we going to have devastating weather events? There's always something to worry about, but you need to be able to get comfortable with that. Otherwise, you go mad. And I think that's the same on the expeditions. When I was trying to row around the Southern Ocean, I remember being basically frightened all the time because it is just a very, very hostile, daunting environment, extremely remote. But you can't let that permanent fear, get to you. You just have to learn to live with it. And I think that sense is really similar in the startup space, that you have to be comfortable with discomfort.
Do you find that some of the same techniques can be applied, if there's any
Don't
technique?
know which is the one. Is it the ostrich technique? You stick your head in the sand, or you look like a duck and you paddle like mad,
Yeah,
or you just sort of blindly keep buggering on.
you just try them all and see what happens.
That's it.
Right. What is the main insight or lesson learned in your expedition career that you have proven to be applicable as a startup founder?
I think probably that, what I flippantly last said, like KBO, that sort of Winston Churchill's great saying, keep buggering on, is really the best one, because, there's highs, there's lows. You might have weeks where it's like, oh my God, what are we doing? Have we made the right choice? No one wants to invest. And then you go through another few weeks where lots of people want to invest, and they're, really aligned, simpatico investors. They are genuinely supportive of what we're trying to do and for the long term. And, they're not the investors who want their money back in 10 minutes, and they don't want any risk. They're realistic. So I think it's just being able to keep putting one foot in front of the other. There's going to be good days, there's going to be bad days, but if you keep putting one foot in front of the other, and then you get through the bad, back into the better days.
And you talked about inclination earlier, the why you do it. Do you reckon it's a similar story when it comes to entrepreneurship?
I think so. I think it's really important. And if I don't think the end goal of, I think you have to fundamentally enjoy the work. And I would say most of our team have an underlying real interest in what we're trying to do. And it might be sort of, slightly different, or slightly different driver for each person, but they are interested in the subject matter, So it's, people aren't getting rock stars wages. Do they think that we can make a financially viable and successful business in due course? Yes, I think they do. Do they think it's going to happen overnight? No, they don't. So what brings them to work? I think it's that fundamental. They are inclined to want to be there. It's interesting to them, and I think that cuts across everything, because it's hard work. It's, as I said, it's a little bit of everything, but it's often cold, wet, dirty, and it's that startup nature of sort of uncertain, antisocial hours, long hours,
Like today?
like today. Yeah.
This seems like a good time to introduce what Archipelago is and your vision for the business. If you could summarize it for people that might not have come across it yet.
So Archipelago is a offshore regenerative farmer, and we are producing kelp and shellfish. We convert our kelp into agricultural products, biostimulants, and feed supplements, and we sell our shellfish into the wholesale markets. And we're also developing a blue or ocean natural capital demonstrator project called the Blue Forest Program, which is trying to prove the benefits of regenerative aquaculture for marine restoration.
What is the problem that the Blue Forest program is trying to solve, and who could be impacted by it?
So, in simple terms, the silver bullet for climate change, people will say, is planting trees on land. And in very simple terms, we're doing the same thing in the oceans. So, if you could take away the sea and look at the seabeds around the UK, which is 2/3 of UK real estate is under the water, we've really wrecked them. We've scraped heavy metal trawls and dredges over almost every inch of the seabed for the last few centuries. So there's not a lot there anymore. So you had, previously kelp forests all over the shop, and what we are and reefs, oyster reefs, shellfish reefs, mussel reefs, and we are looking to reinstate those marine forests. And the idea of that is that that will then act as a fish nursery. It'll boost biodiversity. It will reduce some of the problems with excess nutrient runoff, nitrogen and phosphorus coming out of the rivers, and soak that up, and then they'll grow better as a result of having those nutrients. And to some extent, they'll also soak up carbon as well. So that's what we are looking to do. And then you end up obviously with a balance. So you have these effectively marine forests, which provide some of those ecosystem services, but also you can harvest a proportion of the forest for a crop.
Who are you already partnering with, and what sort of people or organization are you looking to get involved in this journey?
So we are working with a very large food company, are our main partner on the Blue Forest, and also we're working with several universities. So we really have sort of funding partners, and then our research partners. Sometimes they overlap, but our research partners are, I think, 7 different universities. So we work with University of Portsmouth, Exeter, Plymouth Marine Laboratory, Cambridge, and then we also work, actually, it's not the Blue Forest, we work with several of the agricultural institutes on developing our biostimulants. But the Blue Forest specifically, we're funding it through with corporate sponsors, so companies who want to also, see what is the potential of regenerative aquaculture to restore the oceans. Because I think anecdotally, it's pretty well proven that there is a significant benefit to it, but it needs further data. So we've been doing a lot of work in gathering that data from a baseline. If you have a blank slate, a sort of virgin site with nothing on it, what happens then if you install what we call the Blue Forest? So the Blue Forest is a holistic approach where we install oyster reefs on the seabed, mussel ropes in the midwater, and kelp ropes on the surface, creating a sort of 3D complex reef environment, and that becomes effectively like an underwater rainforest. So with all the different types of life that can support.
Yeah, it's amazing. And obviously we talked about the importance of funding and to support projects, and you are of course exploring innovative ways to fund ocean regeneration, including the concept of nutrient credits, which we talked about. In fact, in the very first episode of this podcast, the great Thierry Chopin said that you can make more money with nutrients credits than you can with carbon credits. Could you explain maybe what nutrient credits are and the rationale behind considering them as a funding mechanism for ocean projects?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think the first thing to say is nutrient credits not really established yet in the marine market. So if we look at how the nutrient credit works on the terrestrial side, is in certain areas or in the UK where you have a nitrate vulnerable zone, landowners can be paid to reduce, if they can prove that they can reduce the nitrates emissions from that piece of land, they can be paid, and they in the form of, or they can sell credits from someone who needs to offset their excess nutrient emissions. So in nitrates, for example, where someone might be using too many nitrate fertilizers, if you are the landowner fed, you could install maybe a reed bed, or you might a reed bed, or maybe if you've got a river, you might improve a salt marsh, and that's going to suck up all the excess nasty nitrates and stop them running into the rivers. Then say per hectare of salt marsh or reed bed that you reinstate, and you can calculate how much nitrogen and phosphorus that is gobbling up, and let's say it's 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, you will then get a credit for having taken those excess nutrients out of the system. And the same thing happens broadly with carbon credits, but with carbon credits, obviously a more common mechanism there would be tree planting, and you sell your carbon credits against the trees that you've planted. But the carbon market is now well established, both as a voluntary and formal market. In the nutrient side, there is now a nitrogen trading market, and those on the nitrogen side in the UK, they're quite small projects, but they're trading at a very high price. If carbon's trading at around only €70 a ton, the nitrogen ones are trading between £2,000 and £3,000 a kilo. So the quantum, obviously, if you convert that into tons, is suddenly, £1 million a ton. Sorry, £2 to £3 million a ton of nitrogen removed. And obviously that's overly simplistic, but if you could take out similar quantums of nitrogen or phosphorus using kelp forests or shellfish beds, then you potentially you have the potential to issue those same credits for having removed those excess nutrients from the system. So that's the idea behind it, but there's quite a long way to go to develop the credits. It's very complex. The marine environment is almost always more complex than the terrestrial environment in terms of tracking and proving the long-term capture of those nutrients. So the issuance of those credits is probably some way down the line, but we are working in part through the Blue Forest program to develop we're trying to call it something different, probably a marine token, because the credit market has been rather smeared, I think, by bad actors and snake oil salesmen.
particularly on the carbon credit side. So what you just said about nutrient credits exist for terrestrial agriculture or for terrestrial nutrient credits, but not so much for ocean ones, if I understand correctly. What's on the way? What are any of the open questions that require more research, discussion, or work to better understand the full potential and viability of nutrient credits? And how long do you think it's going to take? Very difficult, I suppose, to say.
I think the question is the challenge is it's often very site by site. So one site might absorb a lot more carbon or nitrogen than another. So you have to prove out over time what you're doing and then how you're treating that site. So if it's in a farmed environment, are you taking all the kelp out? Because that obviously totally changes the treatment. So one question is around the quantum of nutrients being sequestered. So the kelp example, kelp carbon, for example, kelp breaks down into particulate matter. Some of that is dissolved carbon, some of it's particulate, some of it's dissolved. And then how are you going to trace that? Some of that will end up directly beneath a farm, some of that will end up being eaten by fish, some of it will end up in the deep ocean, but that's hard to trace and then come up with a sort of average to issue a credit against. That's on the carbon side. And then the next thing is on the permanence. So depending what form that kelp carbon has taken on depends on the permanence of how long it's sequestered for. And obviously, to have a credit, I think at the moment it has to be sequestered for a minimum of 100 years to be considered sequestered. And the answer as to how long kelp sequestered it for seems a bit of an unknown. There's just huge disagreement in academic circles as to how to treat kelp carbon.
Is that the same story for nutrients, say nitrogen, or is it a bit more less controversial? Say,
I think there's been less work done on the nitrogen because there's not such a immediate market. Because the nitrogen and phosphate markets are much smaller at the moment, less work has been done in that space. So it's all very new, and until you have a market and policy dictating that those excess nutrients need to be removed, then there's not really a driver for the uptake of those credits.
I'll ask a stupid question since we talked about stupid questions earlier. You were talking about the price of nitrogen per kilo and how much higher it seems to be than carbon, for example. Isn't that enough of a driver in itself?
Sorry, isn't that high price a driver for people to create projects?
Yeah. Or does that work against you because they're so expensive?
I think that the problem is that those where you're getting those prices, those are in nitrate vulnerable designated areas, and there's very few of those currently designated in the UK. So you've got, uh, so other than the scientific barriers, of which there's plenty, I think you've then got an offtake and a policy barrier. So, and they're connected, obviously. So if there is a policy saying, well, okay, you're a property developer and you're developing stuff on the banks of the river, and that is causing a higher level of nitrate runoff, you therefore have to buy. You therefore have to offset or mitigate that. The way to mitigate that is you're going to buy these credits. You can buy them from other farmers, or here's some marine solutions like us. And those and that has been put into place in some respects. Sorry, I'm mixing myself up across biodiversity and nutrients, but on the nutrient side, that framework's not in place yet. On the marine side, so policy is missing, and the price is, as you say, is super high. So who's buying those credits at the moment, and who's being forced to buy them?
Yeah, that's the key, right? If they were, if there was a policy that forced people into buying them, then it'll be a different story. But if it's completely voluntary, the price is works against you.
Yeah. And then the same cuts across the biodiversity credit market. And it's already a voluntary biodiversity market. It's now reasonably well established in the form of biodiversity net gain. And there is a draft policy, I think, for marine net gain, which will be the equivalent. So same detail. If you're a developer developing a project, you're going to damage some of the or yeah, damage some of the biodiversity on your site. You can offset that elsewhere. You can offset that on land, but in due course, once marine net gain framework has been applied, you'll be able to do that in the marine setting. And we think that could be potentially very powerful. So, if you're a pet food producer and you're using up loads of fish purely on an extractive basis, shouldn't you arguably be putting something back into the marine environment? So if you were to install a blue forest, which produced, say, 50 tons of fish every year to offset some of your extraction, would be an interesting way of looking at how biodiversity credits might work in a marine setting.
And if you had to place some bets on what would be some of the most interesting business models for ocean impact and ocean regeneration, do you think nutrient credits and biodiversity credits will be an important way of funding these projects?
Yeah, yes, is the short answer. We're doing a lot of work on it at the moment. I think a challenge is the at what point in the system who is we thought the water companies, for example, would be really interested in this because we're building a big forest. It's going to clean up the water, and very interestingly, they would say it's not really their problem. Their job is to create clean drinking water for their customers. Well, the clean drinking water comes down from the sky, it goes into a reservoir, the companies then treat it and then give it to the customers. So we're sort of at the other end of the system. So, which when I say that, it makes it sounds obvious, right? But then, of course, they're also responsible for the sewage and the discharges. And sometimes in the storm surges, then there's a unacceptable level of sewage being discharged, and then you're getting excess nitrate levels in the rivers. And again, that's where our sort of blue forest idea could be helpful in reducing those levels, but it's again quite far removed from that sort of. It's quite downstream, I mean, literally.
Because of the geographical location of where your farm would be.
Yeah, I mean, we could look to change where they're positioned, use them more as bioremediation effects, but anyway, so I think the nutrient opportunity will develop, and I think it could be very interesting, but it's just a lot of work to be done on it. I think the most immediate one seems to me to be the biodiversity, because anecdotally you can just see way more life around these farms compared to a control site, and I think there's more customers for the biodiversity credits, whether that's extractive food companies, pet food companies, large industry, offshore wind potentially, who need to offset any potential sort of environmental impacts that they've had.
But yeah, there's so much we could talk about nutrient credits, and it feels like it's still not quite there, but there's so much potential. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot more to come, hopefully. So a couple of closing ones. When you were 12, 14, you looked at your heroes like Peter Bird and even figures from the golden age of exploration who had a big impact on your life. And I know that somebody listening will be equally inspired by your story and what you have achieved. What is one key piece of advice that you would offer them, particularly around building a business while making a positive impact in the ocean?
Oh, that's a tricky one, but I mean, and I do think the mantra is probably KBO, KBO, whatever you do, because it's not always fun, it's not always pretty, but it's that simple, one foot in front of the other. Get out of bed every day, lace up your boots, and carry on. And yeah, I mean, it's all in the same vein, isn't it? It's like, don't let the buggers get you down. And I think it's the opposite of that guy who told us that 90% of startups fail. Yeah, you need to have the opposite attitude to that guy.
And what is the most important thing that we should have talked about and we haven't talked about as it relates to your work and the question that people ask you or the problems that you care about? What's the most important thing that we haven't talked about?
Well, I think you probably have a better insight on this than me, Fed, and I think everyone in the seaweed sector is looking for the secret sauce, the magical breakthrough. I think we've had frank conversations in the past about that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and illusion in the seaweed sector. And I think we like to try and deal in facts and what works today rather than what works in 5 years' time. And our view, I think, on that is that what works today that we can sell is a kelp-based biostimulant. But I wonder what your view on that is. You've spoken to everyone from all different sort of areas of the sector. I just wondered what your current view of
Mm. Well, it's sometimes difficult not to get a bit negative about it because sometimes you just think, well, the bottom line is not commercially viable at the moment, and nobody seemed to have cracked, bar some exceptions, nobody seemed to have cracked the code of a successful business model around regenerative seaweed farming. And that's a very sad thing to sort of land on, and I don't think it tells the full truth. I think it's maybe just it just represents where we are now, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's where the industry is going. I do think that there is potential, and the seaweed sector, or the if we can make it a bit wider, even the mariculture sector has potential to benefit from a combination of different business models, almost like an ecosystem of different business models where one on its own wouldn't work, but a series of solutions together will work, which is very easy to say, but possibly very difficult to do in practice. But it's kind of what we just talked about. It's putting together the nutrient credits, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, together with selling the products. And I think there's loads of potential for high margin products as well that maybe is still unexplored. There's possibly still a bit of science to be done, but also a lot of better communication, I think, because there is a lot of incredible products that could be made with ocean derived ingredients such as kelp and such as seaweed in general, and we just haven't really packaged it well. Maybe I believe that's an important area. I'm working at the moment with a skincare company, and they are making amazing products that use ocean ingredients, particularly kelp and the likes. And I think there's a lot of potential there, a lot of interest there.
Yeah, really interesting. I think you're right. I think it needs to and will diversify like agriculture. There's not many farmers now just growing. They grow multiple crops. They probably have multiple business lines, whether that's you know holiday cottages or contracting or
Absolutely. Where can people find you? You, Archipelago, the Blue Forest program, learn more about what you guys are doing.
probably. I have to think. What would Tess say? Probably on our Instagram, on our website. Well, maybe me on my website, or could link to my website and the Archipelago website,
Okay,
perhaps.
we'll put everything in the show notes. Very quick, very selfish question to ask you. Where can one watch your documentaries? I know there's a couple around, but I couldn't find them. Are they available to buy anywhere?
Uh, I got them. They're all on DVDs. So let me. I can. Have you got a DVD player? Probably not even.
No, but I'm sure I can find some.
I think I've got one burned as a file. Let me see if I can. I'll try and find the whatever you call it, MP4.
Okay, so they're not available at the moment online.
I mean, I've never put them on, I should have put them on, whatever you can put them on.
YouTube or something like that.
Yeah, I'm so Luddite. No, we have some clips on YouTube, but
Yeah, not the full thing.
not annoyingly, I have lost the logins for that YouTube channel that we used to have,
Oh,
so
really?
I
You're
can't,
logged out?
and you can never access it again.
That same stuff.
Yeah,
Well, hey, thank you for the work that you've done, you're doing, and being an inspiration, a great source of motivation for me personally on a couple of different areas that are very close to my heart, from entrepreneurship to adventure and exploration. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
and you, Fed. Really good to speak, and have a good time in Asia.